So for our introduction to building and editing reports, we're going to start by talking through the ways that we can create a new report in the system. So we've already seen in our running reports how we can create a new saved report. And there are going to be several ways that we can create a new base report in the system as well. So the first way that we can create a new base report in LegalServer is to import an existing report. So the existing report can come from a couple of different places. Number one is it can come from another LegalServer site. So if you have a partner program or you send out an email to the site administrators list and request anyone that has, for instance, a similar grant to share their report with you, they can actually export that report from their site, which you would do just by clicking on this little icon here to export, and send you that XML file, which then you could import into your site. And it's really important to note that you're just exporting and importing the structure of the report, not any of their data. The other way, as I mentioned, is the site admins list. So you can post there and other admins can send you that. And lastly, we also have on our help site, help.legalserver.org, on our reports manual, which is linked right on the homepage, there's a link at the top for example reports. And those are all reports that you can download and import rather into your site. So some really good example reports. They each have a brief description so you can see what they're going to do. And then of course you can always tweak those once you've imported them into your site. Once you have that report, what you're going to do in your site is go up to your actions menu from this main reports page and click on import reports. Here you would just simply choose the files that you have gotten and then click continue, and those reports will end up on your list of base reports. So really easy, really quick way to get some new reports into your system. And as I mentioned, you can always tweak them from there. So if they're not exactly what you're looking for, but they're a good start, it's often a good idea to go ahead and import them and then just adjust them as needed. So that's our first way of creating a new report, just importing it into the system. The second way I'm going to show you is by creating a report completely from scratch. So if there's not a good report to import and you don't have a base report that you want to copy from, which will be the third way that I show you, you can always create a report from scratch. To do that, I can go up to my actions menu and click on add new report. And my first step is going to be to name my report. So we're going to go ahead and build a timekeeping based report. So I'm going to just call it today's date time report. And we're going to decide what to base this report on. So the type of data we need to base it on. So it's going to default to case data. That would be if I want to build a report like we were running earlier. So a case-based report that pulls in case data. But if I want to build a timekeeping report, I can change this to timekeeping. And you'll also see I can base my report on things like clinics, organizations, users, etc. We can put some notes that will display at the top of the report if we need to. And then our next step is going to be to choose some columns to include on our report. Now, this is what we call our column library, and it's not an exhaustive list of all of the columns we can possibly add to this type of report. So if you don't see something on here that you need to add to your timekeeping report, don't be too worried at this point. It is just some of the most popular columns that you might want to add. But again, it's not every column that could possibly be added to this type of report. So I'm going to select a couple columns. We'll do caseworker name, date of service, activity type, and time spent. And then I can click any of these add buttons throughout. And then I get to my final step here, which is the option to go ahead and add some default filtering. So if I happen to know already that I only want time slips of a certain activity type, like case activity, I can apply that filter. Then once I click next, I have my new report. And again, from here, I can add in more columns, which we'll see how to do that in just a bit. I can adjust my filtering further. I can add some totaling at the bottom for some of these columns, etc. So that is creating a report from scratch. And as I mentioned, our final way to create a new base report is going to be by copying an existing base report. So if we want to create a report that's very similar to one of our basic cases reports, and I'm going to use one that's a little bit different from the one we saw earlier, I would want to find that report, and instead of clicking on the report to run it, I want to click on this little pencil icon. That's how we edit an existing report. Now, once I do that, this is what we would call our edit mode of this report. I want to click Save As at the top. So this is how I'm copying this report into a new one, by clicking Save As. And all I have to do is give it a new name at that point. So I now have my copy of that report. You'll see my new name at the top. So we're in the edit mode of that new copy. And at this point, I would make my changes to this new report. So whatever I want to be different from our report rather, that we copied from. So again, I can add new columns, I can add new filters, etc. So that is our final way of creating a new base report in the system. So we saw that we can import reports, we can create them from scratch, and we can also copy existing base reports. So at this point, we're going to switch to talking about editing our reports. So once we have this copy, we can go ahead and make changes to it. So I'm going to do a little bit of cleanup on it first. I'm going to delete a couple of columns just because they're ones that I want to go ahead and add with you. So I'm just going to delete a couple columns here. And I'll do this slowly again later, so don't worry about that too much at this point. All right, so the first thing I want to go ahead and do is add some new columns to this report. And I have several ways that I can do that. The first way is by clicking on Add Column. So up here right underneath Save Changes, I can click Add Column, and that brings up that column library that we saw earlier. So again, some of the more popular columns that we might want to add to reports, but not everything we could possibly add. I can use just my browser search function to find a column. And I'm striking out with those options. Okay, so for instance, total household size, which is actually already on our report, but that's fine. We'll just add it again. So once I find the column I want to add, check it and click our Add button. And once I reload, it adds that new column to our report. And with the column library, it always pops it out to the left here. And if you want to move it, you just drag it over to wherever you want that column to live on your report there. Now I'm going to go ahead and delete the other total household size column, and I'll do it a little bit slower this time so you can see what I'm doing here. So what I want to do is click that little pencil icon for that column, and I get a pop-up. And we'll talk more about some of our other options at the top in just a bit. But what I want to do is go ahead and click delete, or just delete and refresh. And that's just going to refresh my results right away. So to get rid of a column totally, I'm going to click delete and refresh, and that column is gone. Now, as far as adding columns, we have two other ways we can do that outside of the column library. And they're both under this advanced add columns link. So that's going to give me a separate pop-up, and you'll see method 1 at the top and method 2 at the bottom. Now, really important to note is that you only want to use one of these at a time. You can certainly use both method 1 and method 2 on the same report, but only one at a time for each of these pop-up sessions. We're going to start with method 1, and it is really simple to use. It's a lot like adding a field on a form. So if you've ever done that, you would see a drop down for field, and you can scroll through this, or a little easier would be to type in a keyword like race here. Select that field and click add. It will do a little refresh, but it stays on this page, so you can keep adding fields as needed, like our gender field. Now, once I get to a field that I don't find in method 1, and a good example of that is county of residence. So if I start to type in county, I see a couple of options, but I don't see county of residence. So what I know from that is that I'm going to have to go to method 2 to add that. But I don't want to do that yet because I've used method 1 to add gender and race. So I want to X out of my pop-up, reload my report, make sure I see my 2 new columns there, and then go back into advanced add columns. And now I can use method 2. So our example is that we want to add county of residence. And with method 2, the great thing about it is that if you can add a field to a report of this type, so for ours, a case data report, it's going to be available somewhere in method 2. Whereas the column library and method 1 are a little bit easier to utilize, but you're not guaranteed to find the field there. With method 2, if you can add it to the report, it's going to be available there. Now, the reason that it can be a little bit trickier to use for newer admins, newer report builders, is because it's more of a traditional database structure. So you have to go through and add subtables and fields under those subtables. So if I open this up, you'll see things like a custom subtable, and that's where any custom fields that you have added to your site will live. So this demo site has a lot of silly options, like do you like to eat food, client wants a t-shirt, favorite book, but these are all custom fields that have been added to this site. So if you ever need to add a custom field to a report, you want to look under a custom subtable. Now for our example of county of residence, we actually want to start on the person subtable. And the person subtable is where you're going to see many things related directly to your client. So this is also where gender and race are coming from. So to add county of residence under our person subtable, I have to find a subtable called primary home address. And again, that's because that's where our county of residence field lives in the database. I have to add another subtable called address, a final subtable called county of residence, and then under there, I can finally go ahead and add my county of residence field. So as you can see, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 subtables, and then finally our field. And then once I go ahead and X out of our pop-up and refresh, we're going to see our county of residence field here. Now, I happen to have memorized that path for county of residence, and many of you probably also will memorize some of these paths as you start building more and more reports. But we also have a handy section of our help site, again, on the reports manual. And it's the final section of the reports manual called Nuggets. And this will give you many of the common paths to things you might want to add to your reports. So for instance, here is our county of residence path that we just did. You'll also see other address information. You'll see adverse parties, how we can add them to a report, client age, assets, different types of assignments, which is a really popular one. Things like custom fields, like I talked about, date open range, etc. So it's basically a cheat sheet for how to add these things through Method 2. And as I mentioned, as you build more and more reports, you're going to get more comfortable with Method 2. Most of our admins that have been working on reports for a long time will actually just go directly to Method 2 because they know it so well. And again, they know that a field is going to be available there if they can add it to the report. All right, so that is all of our different ways to add a column to our report. And I'm going to go back into editing our columns. So I went into edit our column earlier to delete that duplicative household size, but we have a couple of other options there as well. One thing I can do is just change the heading of that column, and it's not going to change the field name in the system throughout or on any other reports. It's just for this report. We can also change the format. This is mostly helpful with date types of fields. But you can also do things like just show me the first word, show me the leading numbers. So for problem code, I could apply this and refresh and just see that code for the legal problem code if that's what I wanted to do. And again, for date fields, you can do things like year only, age in days or years. So it can be helpful there. Aggregate is not something we're going to talk about today or show any examples of in depth, but I do just want to kind of point out what that is so you know it's something that's available. The aggregate option is a way to bring your report back down to one row per case. So if you're looking at your report and this unique count number does not match the number of rows that you have in your report, that means you have more than one row per case. How that happens is you've added something to your report that has a more than one relationship to the case. So for instance, pro bono assignment. So if a case is assigned to 3 different pro bono attorneys, you're going to have 3 rows for that case. And sometimes that's fine. Other times, for accounting purposes and things, we want just 1 row per case. So what you would do is aggregate that pro bono name column, and you would bring it back to 1 row per case. And again, if you have questions on that, there's a whole page on the help site within the reports manual, a whole section. And also, we can always cover those questions and examples in that report builder office hours. So a couple more things to point out here. This show option. So when we were running our report, you probably remember that when it came to the data options or columns, I had those that were showing by default, and I also had some available to add that were hidden by default. So this is where you can set that. So if show is set to yes, it's a default column. If I go ahead and set this to hide and apply and refresh, it's going to drop off of showing here, and instead it's going to show in this hidden column section. So these hidden columns are the ones that would be available for users to add in if they want to see them. And then lastly, you can add a filter for a column right from here, and then you can, of course, delete it and apply any changes at the bottom. And I see a question in the chat, which is, can we create calculated columns? Yes, there are options for creating calculated columns. Typically, you'll have to work with Ron for that. And that would be something, again, that would be a really great thing to bring up in that report builder office hours session. If you can't wait for that Tuesday coming up with that, I believe it's the 4th Tuesday, so in 2 weeks, you can always send us a request to support as well. But yes, those are an option. All right, so that's everything for our columns. So I do want to touch on our filters, of course, as well. So if I open up our filters here, I can see all of the available filters, and the ones that are bold at the bottom here are our default filters. So by default, this report is going to pull in cases opened last year where the grant is Xander's funding code. Now, one important thing to point out is that you can only have a filter for a column that you've added to the report already. So if I want to filter on client t-shirt size, I have to add that as a column to my report before I can add it as a filter. Now you can always hide that column so it doesn't show by default and it's just a default filter, but it does have to already exist as a column on the report. And that's why this drop down for set a column as a new filter rather, is just showing us columns on the report, both the display ones and the hidden ones. So I could come down here and add a new column, for instance, on county of residence. And right now it's just an available column, so the user can add something if they want. But I could also edit this and add in a default value. So say the person has to be in Cook County, apply and refresh, and now I'm down to 8 rows once I've applied that default filter. Another thing to mention about our filters is that by default, they're all going to have an and join, which you'll see at the top here, but you can create or filters. So for instance, if I want to show all cases where either the grant is Xander's funding code or the county of residence is Cook County, what I want to do is drag one of those on top of the other and then click that and make it an or. And now we get to 41 cases that either have the grant as Xander's funding code and or the county of residence as Cook County. Now, if I wanted to go back to an and join, I can click it, and I can also just drag these away from each other. And we go back to just our regular and joins there. Couple last things to point out. All the way at the bottom of each column is where we can do those breakdowns, unique counts, sums, and averages. So again, B is for breakdown. That shows us the specific number, like 2 closed and 6 open. Unique count just shows us the unique amount of unique values in that column. And then for a numerical field, like total household size, we can do a sum or we can do an average. And again, whatever you set up here is what the end user will see when running that report. And then last thing I want to quickly get through is our attributes at the top here. So these are going to be kind of the basics of the report. So this is where we can update the name. Show tabular format, you almost always want that checked. The tabular format is this format that we've been looking at. So the only time you might want to uncheck that is if you have other additional display formats like a crosstab or a pie chart. That's all you want the user to see when they run the report. We can also select run on open. So what that's going to do is instead of showing that message, please click run report to view results. It's just going to show you results right away. View all data when a report is opened. You want to be really careful with that one. You rarely want to check that. What that's going to do is just show every row based on the default filters right when someone clicks to run the report. So for this report, it wouldn't be a big deal. We only have 8 rows right now, and I wouldn't think this would go up very much since it's pretty filtered down. But if you have a report that's just show me all of our closed cases ever, you definitely don't want to check that because it's probably thousands of rows and it's going to slow down that person's computer. Enable nest loop. The developers tell us that if you check that or uncheck that, depending on what it currently is, if your report is going slower than you would expect it to, that can help improve performance. You can decide how the orientation should be for an Excel output. Should this report be active? So this is probably the biggest one you'll be adjusting in this attribute section most often. So again, we can't delete a report, but we can inactivate it just by unchecking there and saving. And then you can add it to, again, a category like our case data, a type, grouping, which we don't have anything in the lookup in this site, but that's just a lookup you can add your own values to, and offices. And really, again, the main purpose of all of those is really just to be able to filter your main report list by those values. And then here is where we can set some permissions for this report. So as I mentioned earlier, each report has its own permissions. So, and they're based on user role. So I could say that, well, generally most users are able to run reports. Only those under these specific roles can run this one. So admins, report builders, and our pro bono coordinator. Now, the most important thing about this attribute section to remember is if you've made any changes throughout, you have to click apply or apply and refresh, and then your main save changes at the top. If you don't click apply first in that attribute section, it's not actually going to save it. So really important to remember, if you're ever struggling with, I've tried to deactivate this report 2 or 3 times, it's not sticking, you've probably forgotten to click that apply button. So always remember to click that first and then your main save changes. And then last, just to mention, again, we're not going to be able to get into this today. This would be one of our more advanced topics, but I do just want to point out we have this additional display format section. So on any report, you can add those things like crosstabs, pie charts, bar charts, etc. And you can add as many of those for each report as you want to, or just have none and have the basic tabular data at the bottom like we have here. All right, so that is everything for our introduction to building and editing reports.